Hi and welcome back to my channel. In this week's episode of Recent Reads, I have quite a few books to talk about. A lot of books that I had very interesting experiences with. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by talking about the books that I read as audiobooks before getting to books that I read physically, and then finishing with several arcs that I read towards the end of the week. So let's start off with the first book that I read via audiobook, and that is Deathless Divide by Justina Ireland. So this is the conclusion to the Dread Nation duology. Prior to this, every book that I had read by Justina Ireland alone, not one that she'd co-authored, gave her books 5 stars. So this ended up being a little bit of a disappointment. Spoiler alert. Still really, really good. So I'm not going to go into the plot in general, not in general, specifically in this book, because obviously it's the conclusion to the duology. But in this world, it's alternative history, which Justina Ireland does really well. In this, it's set, I think, in like the 1880s. But what happened was, I think, the Battle of Gettysburg. Instead of the dead staying dead, they rose up and became zombies, or what they call shamblers. So they're having to deal with that. And in the first book, Jean, the main character, ends up, through a series of circumstances, being sent out to Kansas and having to deal with a situation out there. Things unfold, and it leaves off not on a cliffhanger, but close to a cliffhanger. And that's where this book picks up. One thing that she did in this book that I really enjoyed was she split the perspective. Instead of it being entirely from Jean's perspective, you also get Catherine's perspective. Catherine was a character that you saw throughout Dread Nation, the first book in the duology. But in this book, you actually get her perspective. The problem for me, so it picks up almost right away from where Dread Nation left off. And then you have this really rapidly moving plot. Something happens, and then all of a sudden, we're a year in the future. It was a very unexpected time jump. And the atmosphere of the book changes a little bit. For a little bit of time in here, you're not really dealing with the shamblers. They're mentioned, but it becomes more Western, and they're all heading towards California. Of course, the shamblers become part of it again, but that middle lull and that shift is what kept it from a 5-star, which is really disappointing. I still really, really enjoy Justina Ireland's writing. This one let me down just a little bit, but by the time it finishes, it had gotten almost back up to what I had liked in general about her works. The other thing that I realized that kept me from really, really enjoying this book was I wanted an answer to something that I don't think Justina Ireland ever planned to answer or solve in this duology. You know, mixed expectations. But overall, this was a 4-star read. All right, next we have Lost in Time by A.G. Riddle. This is a Goldsboro book with fantastic sprayed edges. I ended up enjoying this book a lot more than I thought I was going to. So in this, there is a company that this group of people have created called Absalom, a technology basically, and the company was named after the technology, where they wanted to initially come up with something that could revolutionize shipping and get things from place to place really quickly. It ended up that it didn't work. And so what ended up happening was they could send people back in time to a different reality, which, interestingly enough, is the second book that I've read this month that deals with time travel, but with alternate realities. The book opens up and becomes sort of a murder mystery because one of the creators, one of the scientists, is found murdered, and one of the other scientists and his daughter are implicated in this. And through a series of events, the father, the person part of the company, ends up confessing and being sent back in time to the Triassic period through their own machine. And the daughter is determined, back in their regular timeline, to figure out what happened. And I realized through reading this that this inkling that I've had of getting back into murder mysteries, I think I need to follow up on that because I loved that part of it. The portions after Sam, the dad, the person that was part of the company, get sent back to the Triassic, obviously there's survival. Because he doesn't want it to be a death sentence. He wants to get back to his family. He doesn't know how that's going to happen. I tend to not like survival stories, which ended up being the case for this book here. Those portions, they were not a lot of them. Things twist and turn, and I liked a lot of the twists and turns, and when something gets revealed, I'm like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. But then you get to the end. I'm not going to say, obviously, what all the problems were, what they had to solve, etc., etc. I'm just going to say that literally every single loose end and part of the plot got tied in a nice, pretty, happy bow at the end. And I went, no. What? No. So ultimately, this is a 4-star book and it'll be staying in my collection. Just those two things brought it down for me. Next, we're going to talk about a book that I read the majority of audiobook and then finished off the last 90 or so pages physically, and that is The Whispering Dark by Kelly Andrew. Unfortunately, spoiler alert, this book is going to get unhauled, which is kind of gutting because look at those sprayed edges. These are some of my favorite sprayed edges. So at first, I was really into this book. So a little bit about the book. Kelly Andrew writes a character who she knows well. Kelly Andrew herself, the author, is deaf, and she went deaf when she was around 4 years old. Very similar situation for the main character, Delaney Myers Petroff. The number of times her whole name is stated in this book is ridiculous. But anyway, Delaney, or Lane, also goes deaf after suffering from an illness. And so its own voices, and it's done really well. And the start of this book, which I think should be categorized as new adult, not young adult, because it's college age. When she was a child, came across a boy who looked like he was drowning. She wanted to help him, said something to him, but then her parents are calling after her, trying to find her, and she has a cochlear implant, by the way. And she goes back to her parents, tells them about this boy, comes back and he's not there anymore. Turns out that boy is the other main character in here, Colton Price. Even though they don't really talk to each other at that point, when they end up crossing each other's paths at this college, they both instantly know each other somehow. Okay. All right. I'm willing to let you have that. Maybe you'll explain it. Lane ends up at getting a scholarship, a full ride scholarship, to this very unique school that deals in the paranormal, because she's always been able to hear the shadows, hear whispering in the dark, even when she has her cochlear implant off. This whole school deals with, it's not the whole university, but this section of it. And so there's lots and lots of talk of the paranormal. But she gets this scholarship, she goes off there, and this whole time, Colton is being told, don't get involved with her, don't get involved with her. He doesn't listen. And so the first part of the book, I was kind of into. It was weird, but the kind of weird that I can go along with. But questions keep being raised without answers being given, and things happen in the plot that don't really make sense. And it just keeps getting weirder and weirder and weirder and weirder. And it came to a point where I had like an hour or so left on the audiobook. About 90 or so pages, because I was listening to it at 3 times speed. And I just did not want to pick up the audiobook. I didn't want to listen to it anymore. And I'm just like, I think I can finish the last 90 pages faster than I can with the audiobook. It just is the type of weird that is not my sort of thing. And you finish the book, nothing really is resolved. The world doesn't make sense. The things that happen don't make sense. the explanations that she has in here don't make sense. Atmosphere, on point. Plot, in the tank. So ultimately, I think I rated this 3.5 stars. Now, let's get to the books that I read physically. Start off with Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. After reading this, I can now see why some people would be willing to say this is a young adult book or would be appropriate for young adult readers. I don't have a problem with that. There are a lot of other things that I have a problem with in this book. You know, a lot of people know about Project Hail Mary, but briefly, in this, they discover that something's going wrong with the sun. The sun is dimming and it's going to cause catastrophic climate effects to the planet. And they've got to fix it. And you end up with Project Hail Mary. And the main character in here, Ryland Grace, he ends up on this project because of this paper that he wrote back when he was in academics. But he's not in academics anymore. He's a junior high science teacher. The fact that throughout this entire book, he keeps referring to himself as a junior high science teacher, I'm like, you are showing your age, Andy Weir, because there may be a few junior highs across the country, scattered here and there. Pretty much everyone calls it middle school. And that was one of the big things that just, I was like, no. No. He keeps, at random points, referring back to being a junior high teacher, or, oh, I can't wait to talk about this with my students, or other sorts of things like that that just were not realistic. Like, that's not what teaching is. That's not what you would encounter as a teacher. At one point, when he wakes up on this spaceship completely alone, it's another part of this, he remembers some random bit of fact and associates that with being a junior high science teacher and having posters up on his wall. The fact is so specific. It's like this range, this data range. And I'm just like, I have lots of posters up on my wall, but I'm not going to remember some random fact that's up on my poster about a certain biome. I teach human geography. So that rubbed me the wrong way. And then there's also a lot of implausibility with another character that comes along partway through. A lot of people have said this is a spoiler. I don't think it's a spoiler. He encounters an alien. And this alien is also trying to save his world. He names him Rocky. Obviously, they don't speak the same language. They're very different language. And apparently the speech that Rocky is, it's a very tonal, musical language. And somehow this junior high science teacher has perfect pitch and has a computer to solve everything. And they magically learn each other's language like that. He talks about the process just a little bit, like stumbling across things, using a computer to help. And I'm like, that is not how you learn languages, especially if you have zero in common with the other language. Language learning takes a lot more than that. Speaking of communication, they're somehow able to participate in science experiments together that involve very, very specific types of data and data collection. At one point he's talking about such and such degrees Celsius. And I'm like, even though, yes, they've established that Rocky may not be thinking Celsius in his mind, but somehow for Ryland Grace to say 80 degrees Celsius, that correlates to the exact temperature that Rocky is thinking. Like, that's not how math and scientific concepts work. Not every culture had a concept of zero. Okay? That came from India. No, it just, the implausibility of it, I'm just like, no. And the way it ends, I'm just like, really? He'd end up there instead? Okay. The only saving grace, sorry about that pun, because his last name is Grace. The only saving grace of this book is Rocky. I love Rocky as a character. He's adorable. But the implausibility of it just, I'm like, no. And Ryland Grace himself, he's not funny. He acts like a middle school boy. I know. I've taught them for 7 years. So ultimately, this is a 3-star read. Okay, and now for the last physical book that I read, we have One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. So I actually read this before The Whispering Dark, but this is also, so I read several weird books this week, and I'll talk about another one that I ended up DNFing. But in this world, there are cards. I can't remember what they call the cards, but there's like 12 different cards and different numbers of each of these cards. And they're very similar to the idea of tarot cards, the major arcana of tarot cards. But if you hold these cards, you can do certain types of magics. There are positive things that you can do with certain cards, but there's also negatives to those cards and drawbacks when you use them. But there's also this thing in the world, like the mist, and it sometimes will infect people, and they'll get really, really sick, and then they'll end up with some sort of magic. And that is highly looked down upon. Like, those people are persecuted and killed. But seeking these cards, using these cards, is sought after by the rich people. That was a discrepancy that I couldn't really understand, but that's the world. And the main character, when she was a young girl, she was infected. And so she has this magic. But her father, even though he shouldn't have, because he was the head of this, these soldiers, this company that the king uses to seek out the infected and basically kill them. So he hides her away, sends her off to, I think, her mother's sister. So her aunt and uncle, and they raise her, they hide her. She's not taken and killed, obviously. Her magic, I think, is whenever she touches one of those cards, she absorbs its power. And she ends up, the first card, the only card that she touches is the Nightmare card, which is very ominous. And she ends up living with the nightmare in her head. And that gives her another power, because the nightmare can see colors associated with the cards, even if they're like tucked into a pocket or something. The only way to defeat, so what they want to do, what the king wants to do, and this other group that she ends up joining up with, they want to find they want to find all 12 of these cards, including one that's been missing for forever, to basically conquer the mist and keep it from basically devouring their world. Her being able to see different colors for the different cards will help them find the rest of these cards. There's a conspiracy involving people close to the crown, and I really actually ended up enjoying this. So there are a lot of tropes in here that are, you think about young adult fantasy tropes, they're probably in here. But I really enjoyed it. And I thought that Rachel Gillig did an excellent job with the atmosphere. It really puts you in there, and it showed, what was her name? Showed Elspeth's descent, because this magic infection, it eventually will degrade the person. And she thinks she hasn't been degrading, but this shows that she was. But Rachel Gillig really shows that in a way that what happens at the end of this book really makes a lot of sense. I have requested the second book on NetGalley. So I really do want to finish this. Ultimately, is it a perfect book? No, but I really enjoyed my time, which shows that sometimes weird books can work for me. This ended up being a 4-star. I will do that transition even though it was the second arc that I read this week. This finished off my TBR for the month. There were a couple books that I just decided I don't feel like reading this month. They were, I think, an SCASL book and something else that I can't remember, but they weren't necessarily quote unquote required for me. So I went into reading arcs to finish off the month to try to catch up on the arcs. I ended up reading one that I actually checked out from the library because I couldn't find a copy of the arc on my Kindle, and that is A Hunger of Thorns. This, out of the 3 weird books that I read this week, was the weirdest. So this book is more witchy than fantasy. And in this world, which I don't think is the quote unquote real world. I think it was an alternative of the real world with a lot of things that are similar. There is magic. There are witches, but there was basically a war between them. The witches were sort of conquered, and there are certain covenant spells that they can do that are spelled out in the agreement between the ruling side and the witches. But her mother, the main character's mother, was part of the rebellion, was doing dark magic, etc. She herself used to have magic, but then around the time that puberty started, her magic dried up. And she had this best friend who basically was using her for the magic, because the best friend was not a witch. She was not magical. And when the main character Maud, when her magic dried up, the friend abandoned her. And that also happened to coincide with when they started with high school. And the book opens up with a memorial service for her friend, for Odette. It's 4 years later. Her friend has gone missing, and they're assuming that she's not dead. She doesn't believe this. She's sort of obsessed with her friend. Not sort of. She is obsessed with her friend. And she's trying to find her. All of that I can work with. Weird, witchy, okay, I can deal with. Then it got weirder and weirder and weirder and more sensual, way more sensual. And I just was like, this is uncomfortable. I don't like where this is going. This is very weird and not making sense at all. And the friend that she's obsessed with is toxic. I really don't want to read this. I made that decision around 38%, but to feel comfortable, it's imposed on myself, I read to 50% and then DNF'd it and left the review. So I can deal with weird to a point. This one just got too weird. And I did read other reviews of people talking about the fact that, like, yeah, this was a problem. Same things that I was having a problem with. Two other arcs that I read. One is the sequel to another book that I read last year, and I think I also read it as an arc. I don't remember. This is Shinji Takahashi, Into the Heart of the Storm by Julie Kagawa. I've read lots of Julie Kagawa books, and I really enjoyed the first book in this series. It's, again, one of those middle grade mythology, and this was interesting because it was mixing together two different types of mythology, or at least Shinji is Japanese, I believe, and he ended up with the Mark of the Coatl in the first book. That's the name of the first book, but the Coatl is Mesoamerican, part of, I think, Aztec mythology. And so he deals with a lot in that first book. In this second book, his aunt, who he lived with, is off somewhere else for her safety, and he is at basically, it's abbreviated SEAS, Society of something or other, I can't remember. And he's basically trying to harness his magic and learn so that they can go up against this other big bad company, etc. Unfortunately, he doesn't go through any growing or learning or any real character building things in this. The whole book, which was not bad, but it just kind of read like Adventure of the Week. So they end up going to this place in the South Pacific to try to find some sort of remnants at a shipwreck of these people that a lot of people have talked about. Oh, they weren't real, but they want to find those remnants and preserve that for history's sake. Things happen there, you know, basically Adventure of the Week. There's no other better way to talk about that. It was fine. I just finished it. I'm like, that did not advance the macro plot at all. Thankful that I read it as an arc, but this ended up with 3 stars. And lastly, I read a nonfiction. I'm almost done with another arc that's nonfiction, but I'll talk about that in a second. And that is The Me Too Effect, which, after filling out all the information in my reading spreadsheet, I realized this is published by University Press, so that fits along with my critique that it's very, very dense. It didn't put me off. Well, it did put me off a little bit, but I was able to get through it, and it didn't keep me from understanding and seeing the overall point that Lee Gilmore is making in this book. But it did track with what I discovered. So Lee Gilmore in this book, in the preface, she sets up how the book is going to be organized. She sticks through with that, makes a very solid argument about the ways that this has affected these stories of how women have been sexually assaulted in the past and not believed, how the whole system has functioned beforehand and how we can change it. The only thing that kept me off was just a lot of her paragraphs were really long, and it felt like being sucked under because it's so heavy, and only periodically being able to come back up to take a breath before being sucked under again. There are so many sources. She researches this and cites her sources out the wazoo. It is so structured. Like, she is proving her point. You need to listen to her. It's so strong and compelling. It's just not an easy read, both on subject matter and how it's written. But I do recommend it. I forget what I rated this. I think 4 stars. And then the book that I am finishing, I'm about an hour away on audiobook from finishing, is I Swear, The Government is Messier Than My Minivan, written by Katie Porter. So Katie Porter is a fairly new representative. I think she's now in her 3rd term in the House of Representatives. And this is her memoir. She was the first single mom to be elected to Congress, which that happened in 2018. It took that long. And she has a very compelling, engaging voice as she writes this, and she also narrates this. And she's talking about a lot of different stuff that happens along the way. And I am just absolutely fascinated by her memoir. I've put it on my wish list on bookshop.org. It is hands down a very, very compelling memoir that pulls in all these other, she appeals to these different things that she is so motivated to actually try to solve these different problems with basically the world. And I cannot wait to get a physical copy of this. So there you go. There are all of the books that I read this week. It was quite a few. Still in denial that by the time this starts, I will be back to work for several days. We're not going to acknowledge that. I hope to continue this pace, because what better than denying that you have to go back to work than with reading? It's fine. I'm fine. Everything's fine. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.